Another draft physics presentation, another question video, so see the previous video if you haven't seen it, regarding some fundamental questions regarding the foundational experiments of quantum mechanics and relativity and their problems, glaring, kind of obvious problems that aren't addressed by physics, generally speaking. So related to that, quickly, on the subject of gravitational lensing, the thing that made Einstein famous. Einstein's right because this gravity lens, as I pointed out in the previous question video, the mathematics is suspect. And thinking about the lens, what gravity creates, in the sense that gravity reflects light, deflects light, refracts light, it does it more the closer you are to the gravitational body and less the further away you are. And as lenses work, it's inverted in the sense that the light that goes through the center of a regular lens is not changed at all, and the light that comes in on the edges is the light that is bent the most. So more bending at the edges, less bending in the center, where with gravity there is more bending at the center. So I can't really draw that, but light that would go in the center is going to be bent by the gravity, harsh angles. Light that goes out to the edges will be straightened, so or have its path not changed at all. So if you think of it in terms of something going past gravity, it gets bent a lot close, gets bent a little bit further away you go, and that's the opposite of what you need when you're trying to view something from far away. You're trying to capture the light from, and gravitational lenses are huge, hundreds of thousands of light years and such, really big lenses, and you need this highest angle light to bend the most to come down to a new focus. So this traditional lens is not a gravity lens, and so there's no rational explanation for how this lens can produce the same results as this lens when it's doing exactly the opposite of what is necessary to capture light to a focus. So needed to add that to the other problems the theory of gravitational lensing has. Poor mathematics and horrible premises. Alright, other things on the list, which I can't find at the moment. Yeah. No, I wrote them down somewhere. Alright, single surface interference, something never talked about, but when they do careful optical experiments, you can create a single surface and you pass light across it, and you will get a pattern from a single surface. So we have all these ideas about how you need to cut waves and do this and do that to create this interference, to create two photons, and there's no theory of two photons for a single surface, and it seems clear that that should be a kind of clear indicator that the phenomenon of interference has something to do with the matter and less to do with the photons. The photons are being manipulated by something the matter produces, which I would argue is a field around it of electrical potential, that everything material is excreting a kind of magnetic gravity, a residue of the protons and electrons that it's made up of, and that residue holds electrons, and that those electrons can deflect light. And I think these kinds of experiments indicate that, and they just don't include them in their conversations. They pretend that the Young experiment was the first notice of this thing called interference when Newton had discovered it long ago. The whole story is made of very selective experiment mining. Maybe that should be a new term. Experiment mining. They find the experiments that verify their diagram of reality, and they exclude the experiments that make it sound suspect. So talk about Young, don't talk about Newton. Talk about the double slit, don't talk about the single slit. And this is a foundational experiment to all of quantum mechanics, is the idea that photons can do this interference thing. Now, a point I have raised, maybe in the previous video, but I'm not sure, but I'll raise it again, is that we don't have a model from quantum mechanics telling us whether this is something individual photons can do, different photons can interfere with each other and produce a result, or whether this is a phenomenon strictly of an individual photon encounters something, and that thing causes the single photon to split into two photons, creating two waves that interfere with each other, and blah blah blah. So that a single photon interferes with itself, or whether different photons interfere with each other. Now, when they start to talk about the prismatic effects of, say, a soap bubble and how it reflects light, they'll talk of as if two photons are interfering with themselves. Yet there's no evidence that that's taking place, and again, there's lots of evidence that what's really taking place is there's internal reflections that are separating the light. The higher frequency light takes one path, the lower frequency light takes another path, and the internal reflections dictate how separate those two paths end up being. And it has nothing to do with anything interfering with anything else. It just has to do with the individual color photons refracting at a different angle, and that different angle causes the more internal reflections, and in turn gives you a result of separation. No need for any theory of Huygens or Heisenberg or anything like that. And again, they make no commitment. This is fundamental to interferometers, the two-slit, and the whole theory of quantum mechanics, and yet we don't get any hard answers to simple questions. Is this a single photon phenomenon, or is this a phenomenon that takes place where any number of photons can interfere with each other? No explicit answer to the simple question. All right, electrons and acceleration. I've sort of touched on this subject a little bit, but the idea is that from all the experiments I've ever seen, electrons, to move an electron, you have to keep hitting it. That is, you just have to keep hitting it. The force has to be continuous. And as soon as you stop hitting it with a voltage, it stops moving very quickly. And this is seen in like beta decay and stuff, where the decay or the radiation travels a very short distance from where it's produced. So as soon as you could argue that as soon as it goes off its direction, it loses the voltage behind it, the force that was propelling it, and as soon as that force stops, it stops. And so this is sort of a known thing, you could say. You could argue it's sort of validated by the fact that we can't create an electron gun. We can't shoot electrons anywhere unless we do apply a voltage. We keep them, keep pushing them. And you can't send one to the moon, for example. You can't put some electrons in the vacuum of space, you know, the place where there's very few atoms for it to interact with, and you can't send a volume of electrons anywhere, you know, unless you have an infinite supply of energy to keep pushing it. So electrons only accelerate. And so in the standard model of the atom, you have the nucleus with the protons and neutrons, and you're supposed to have these electrons constantly orbiting, yet there's no explanation for where the energy comes from to maintain the velocity against the attractive magnetic force. So there's two forces. As with Earth, there's the acceleration down towards, and there's the velocity the Earth has, and it's the velocity the Earth has that keeps the Earth from falling into the Sun. Without its velocity, the one force wins, the Earth crashes into the Sun. So they've modeled the atom the same way, and they have this assumption that electrons, for some reason, have this intense velocity that keeps them from crashing into the magnetic polarized nucleus. And but there's no explanation for where that energy comes from, or how an electron in every other circumstance that can't maintain velocity somehow can maintain a velocity inside of an atom, and that how it can be captured in this atom no matter what speed it's traveling. I can put electrons into a circumstance, into proximity to atoms at any velocity, and they will somehow acquire the necessary velocity to keep spinning. So there's absolutely no explanation for where that movement or energy or force or whatever comes from. Now this is sort of related to another subject. I guess I should give the counter argument. The counter argument I would make is that atoms don't have spinning electrons. That the fact is that the nucleus is made of protons and neutrons, and the neutron is essentially a proton and an electron associated with each other, and then the other proton merely fits itself to create a balance in terms of it ends up attaching to the neutron, and then you have the two can get very close to each other because the electron provides a conduit for all the reflective forces to escape. So all the black force would leave through the protons, all the red force would leave through the electron, and you couldn't build any reflective pressure. So the naturally opposing protons that in nature, if you bring them closer together, the red force would just keep bouncing back and forth between them and get stronger and stronger as you brought them closer and closer together. I realize this lighting is a little dim on this side. I probably should stay away from that side. And regardless, so you have a nucleus that would have these, the neutrons are providing electrons to bond protons. So the idea is that it's proton rich, but it's got some electrons in it. And the argument would be made that, and I can't even be sure that the nucleus is what they say it is, in the sense that it doesn't spread. But regardless, let's just say this is the electron that is now in an imbalance where it's attracted to the proton heavy nucleus, the positive heavy. And another reason to be suspect of their measurements of charge, and well, I don't know if I want to get into their measurements of charge. You could argue that without them understanding that the neutron has this this fact that it has some neutralizing negative force inside of it, and they're not compensating for that, recognizing that these protons aren't exactly the same charge as the electron. But anyway, so I would argue that the electrons are held in their position by other electrons, and that there's a repelling force between the electrons that compensates for the attractive force towards the protons, and that everything's locked in positions, and those positions are stagnant. They're not spinning at half the speed of light or some other preposterously fast speed. So on to the next bit. which is the argument about the lack of there being any explanation for the energy involved in, say, just the simple thing of, say, two magnets, or you could argue the Earth and the Sun. The Earth is obviously moves towards the Sun. We know that if we stop the Earth's velocity in the other direction, that the Earth would in fact fall into the Sun. That's not a suspect theory, and yet there wouldn't be any accounting for how the Earth did that. If we just were gods and we could just place an Earth in the position of, say, Saturn, and we gave it no velocity to counter for the gravity, the Earth would just slowly gain speed and momentum towards the Earth and crash into it. And physics, that's supposed to have all these answers and be pretty clear on what it's talking about, can't explain why that happens, where the energy comes from to move a big, giant, massive object. And in the simple example of magnetism, everybody can see it happen. They can hold two magnets. They can feel that the pressure of the magnets wanting to repel or attract. I probably should have drawn this as repulsion for the sake of this argument, just because it's more obvious. I mean, it's more... it's the simpler push mechanism. Attraction is a more complex push mechanism because the force is coming from the external world, and you're actually feeling the low pressure created between them. But regardless, that's where the energy is coming from. So in the simple example of two magnets being attracted to each other, you can hold them apart, and you can feel them pulling towards each other. No mystery. And you can see it. You can just watch two magnets for an apparent undisclosed reason fly into each other. So they defy gravity, they defy air resistance, they defy all the forces that would prevent them from moving, with some kind of force that moves them, that actually moves them. And there's no accounting for any energy equation. Nothing like in all chemistry where there has to be an action before there can be a reaction. There's no cause and effect description of why the two magnets fly into each other. And this is just so fundamental. And to say that it's okay for physics to talk as if they have answers, they have math, and to say we got it when they can't explain something this simple. Why are they atoms inside of this magnet? All these little atoms, all of them, have to, for some reason, move. Something has to tell them, you have to move, you have to go. And this likewise in the other atom, the magnet. And they don't have any explanation, where, I would argue that we already have evidence of cosmic background radiation. And it mocks gravity perfectly, in the sense if you create an external force, you can explain how low pressure is created. In this case, again, it's just like the electron example I gave before. Between the electron and the proton, all the red force leaks out, and all the black force leaks out of the red end, and you don't have any reflections. So this side does exactly the same thing, which means nothing gets trapped in between. There's no red on red circumstance. So therefore there's no force bouncing back and forth. The red reflects off the red, the black reflects off the black. So all you have to do is include into the cosmic background radiation a polarized force, that is two kinds of force. And you have two kinds of matter, the electron and the proton. And you have a full, rich explanation for where the force comes from, why the magnets move together, and why the magnets move apart. No woo necessary, no magic, no non-forces, non-energy. You have a real explanation, and all it depends on you understanding is that basically the universe, the energy in the universe, is compressive in its nature. It's creating pressure. and it's dense and coming from every direction, like the cosmic background radiation. Alright, the radar experiment I just thought I'd mention. So I'll mention just a couple of ideas. So these aren't really questions, just stuff I'm thinking about, and so input on them would be interesting maybe. But yeah. So I am working on a proof, at least a disproof of one element of quantum mechanics, where they argue that in an experiment where you use antennas to simulate two slits, so you create one signal, and then you put that one signal on two separate antennas, so it's exactly the same signal on both antennas. And the idea is that this simulates the two waves, and that the two waves interfere with each other and create places where there is signal and there isn't signal if you attempt to detect it. Now, they always do this experiment with a carrier signal on this signal, and then say, where do I hear a tone and where do I not hear a tone? Now the problem is that the signal's a set frequency, and we could make it 20,000 hertz, we could make it anything. They use radar to make this a smaller experiment. If you use higher wavelengths of radio, then you have to have a much bigger experiment, maybe 20, 40 feet, with some radio waves, maybe 100 feet, to be able to detect if there's a pattern. But the idea is that they are attempting to receive the signal they sent. And the problem with that theory is that you're sending two signals, and if those signals get at all out of phase in a physical theory of what radio is, the idea would be is that the radio signal or the light signal is a physical thing, and the only thing that defines it is the separation between the physical things. So light would have, the physical things would be very close. In radio, they would be perhaps miles before the cannonballs hit, so to speak, a much bigger frequency. And all you're doing when you change distances, so for certain positions, the distance would be much longer to get to the same location. So the phase of the ons and the offs, that is where the cannonballs are, will change in terms of their alignment. They won't line up with each other anymore. And what the antenna is going to receive is going to be actually, you know, this much higher frequency with two low frequencies out of phase. So two low frequencies to the antenna receiving the signal is going to look like a very high frequency. And so if you're tuning to a specific frequency, and tuning means you're basically eliminating the higher ones and the lower ones from being received, then you'll have no chance of receiving the signal, because essentially you've jammed your own signal. You've sent two 20 kilohertz signal at different phases to the same location, and the radio receiver will not be able to distinguish one signal from the other. It will essentially be receiving a 40 kilohertz signal. So you've changed 20,000 into 40,000, and you're not receiving it, so you're not tuned to it, so you can't hear it. Just like your radio has to be tuned to a specific station, you've now changed the signal, the station that the signal's on, and that's why you're not receiving it. So if they just measure the energy produced by the two antennas, that is how many photons hit these specific locations, then they would find, I predict, that there is no interference, and that the voltage they will receive at each one of these locations will be identical, because the absolute number of photons hitting here and here are the same. The only thing that changes when you're segregating the signal, when you're saying I can only hear 20,000 hertz, by saying that, you're saying that anytime the signal jams, I'm not going to hear it, and I'm going to pretend there's no signal. There's not no signal. You've just jammed your own signal. So that's my prediction, that quantum mechanics is wrong. It doesn't take place in this circumstance for certain. But I would like to assert that this is a I got you kind of circumstance, where if I'm right, they have to be wrong. But the truth is they're wrong about this assumption that each kind of interference experiment is exactly the same when they're nothing like each other. Doing an experiment with electrons, photons, and buckyballs, for example, whole atoms, molecules, compounds, is a different experiment, because I would argue that the real point is that the experiment of the double slit is really an experiment about the electrons held close to the surfaces of objects, that there are some not free but loosely held electrons near the surface of surfaces, and as you make slits tighter and tighter and tighter, you increase the likelihood of hitting one of those electrons and being deflected by the encounter. Now, a photon will be, by a specific sign theta that's in the math, a photon will be deflected a specific amount based on its frequency and how tight the number of the surfaces are. An electron that hits, so two electrons don't really ever hit each other because they're both creating a repulsive radiation. They're both radiating, probably better to draw that as little dots. They're both radiating dots of energy. In a sense, the energy comes in and the energy comes back out. And the fact is that two electrons find that energy repulsive, so they're both emitting energy. And what will happen is that the energy from one will hit this electron's energy will hit this one, and the two electrons will, even though they're heading right for each other, they will deflect off each other's, off the pressure of the increase in the energy. So they'll never really hit each other. So the two-slit experiment done with electrons, the electrons don't hit each other, but they deflect, and that's why you get a pattern. And it's always a consistent interaction, so that's why the pattern's fairly consistent. And then buckyballs, or atoms, bounce the very least from electrons, and that's why the pattern, when they use atoms, is a very weak pattern, lots of noise in the signal, because the interactions between electrons and whole atoms is a very weak interaction. Alright, another thing I was just thinking about was the shininess of surfaces, and metals are often shiny, and I think this probably has something to do with the fact that there's materials that are more capable of having electrons held on their surface than others, and that shiny surfaces are an indication that the photons never reach the protons, the nucleuses of atoms, and they are always just reflecting off surface, easier to move electrons. So that's just an idea that came to me, that relationship. Another thing I thought about was the Earth isn't really, I mean, this is a huge exaggeration, but it's not round, like perfectly spherical. And so it's a bit misshaped, and it's wider here than it goes across here. So fatter than it is tall. And that disproportion is what really is creating the magnetic effect. So the fact that the Earth is creating that has a magnosphere, it might just be a reflection of the fact that there's an unevenness in the symmetry of the Earth, and that's essentially creating a kind of polarization, because the force laws sort of dictate that if you don't have spherical symmetry, that you're going to have more force going one way than you'll have force bending another way. So it just so the ratio of this lack of symmetry would indicate how magnetic the Earth will be. It doesn't dictate which pole would be relevant. That's probably more of a random thing, like pushing two neutral plates together. They'll sort of randomly, one plate will go positive, one plate will go negative. So which way the poles acquire their, which one becomes magnetic, is not terribly relevant. But it makes me think, or it is curious, that there is an argument that the Earth has gone through polar shifts, and whether those shifts really start with the fact that the Earth, for some reason, regains symmetry, or at least in its core, that the core becomes more symmetrical, so that it could be cycling over thousands of years. It too could be becoming fat in the middle and then stretching in different directions. No evidence, though, that the poles have ever been east-west, but you know. Anyway, just a thought that occurred to me, and that's probably it. Probably enough for this video. I could just mention dark matter real quickly and just point out how no evidence for it, beyond the fact that they have assumptions, just like their standard model of how the atom works and the electrons are spinning. They have assumptions about how gravity works in galaxies, and those assumptions are based on what they see in solar systems. So they see this really heavy sun in the middle, and then they see things orbiting it, and they really don't take any account of the fact that galaxies are structured entirely differently, and that they do have spherical symmetry. There's just as much matter on one side as there is on the other side, and that matter is incredibly dense, where in our solar system there's very little matter moving around. Tiny fraction in terms of comparing the two. I mean, 99.999% not similar to a galaxy in terms of the mass distribution. So in galaxies you have a huge amount of mass in the planets that are orbiting, and so therefore you need a lot less mass in the center, because if I could put another Earth on the other side of the sun, and I could give the two bodies enough gravity to attract each other versus their velocity, there's theoretically nothing wrong with binary orbits. It perfectly fits Newton's mechanism or Einstein's mechanism. There's nothing opposing it, and so it's clearly the mechanism controlling galaxies is that almost every sun is essentially in a binary system with another sun on the other side of the galaxy. There's mass on both sides that are spinning around each other, and obviously your mass is not going to fit. So here they've created dark matter to solve a mathematical problem, and their mathematical problem is in their assumptions, probably. And so now they've created a fake mechanism to fix a problem that doesn't really exist, and they're doing it with all this confidence, and they have no evidence, just no other evidence beside the fact they need it to make their old model make sense, and everybody applauds. I don't think that's very good physics. It's not very good science. It's not good physics. Wrong way to get the right answer. And yet the people who might point that out will be insulted for their trouble. Anyway, till the next time and such.